Hello guys, in this interview I talked with Dana Parker, and she's one of Australia's foremost tango practitioners, a movement therapist, and also a sought after medium and spiritual guide. So she has a very interesting mix of expertise, and we talked on a variety of topics from dance to martial arts and martial arts history to movement therapy, and how we work with movement therapy in different fields, from emotional problems to really physical problems that manifested in the body, to ancestral movement patterns, and it goes on and on. So this is really an enjoyable interview with a lot of topics, and I hope you like it. We filmed the interview, but you can just see us in the first 25 minutes, and then it's mainly an audio interview, so don't be surprised if you can't see us afterwards. So enjoy. So welcome, Dana, and we're gonna talk about movement and our different approach to movement today. And we're here in Dortmund, my hometown, but we just came back from Italy, where we both were teaching in the Spirit of the Hero Camp, which is a new project I'm doing now, and I'm very happy that we met again in Italy and that we have the opportunity to talk here in our mutual friend's home, Joanna, and her cat, Fina.
Of course, we know that this is Fina's house, it's not actually Joanna's.
That's true, yeah.
Which is interesting that we're talking about cats, because obviously both of our work involves ancestral movement, which involves moving like our feline cousins and using this as a way of invoking healing responses in the body.
Yeah, and there we come to the first very interesting topic. So we both have very different background in movement arts, but still it's overlapping. So just tell us a little bit about your background in the moving arts and where you came from, and how that developed.
Awesome. Well, I'm very lucky that my mother thought that it was appropriate for me to start dancing from a very young age. So my first dance class, I was 2.5. And there are pictures of me in a leotard, which was very flattering, of course, on a 2-year-old with a little fat belly. And so I have memories of being dancing since then, pretty much as soon as I could walk, which is interesting to me, actually, that when I have trained with masters who are looking at therapeutic approaches to movement, they often talk about how ideally we want to move like babies, and we want to move like young children who naturally find an innate balance within the center of their body that us as adults we lose. So I'm very lucky that my movement background started so early that when I dance, my brain seems to remember how to move. But this is different to my everyday life. So if I'm in the office, my body doesn't know how to move. And so my movement background first started, of course, with calisthenics, which is a very particular type of movement training that you find in Australia, different to the US. But I've also done ballet training. I did about a decade of ballet training. I did gymnastics as a child. I also have done the full spectrum of contemporary dance, jazz, tap, modern. And I matriculated in contemporary dance. I also dance salsa and social forms, and I'm also a tango teacher. And that's a social form of tango that's danced currently in Buenos Aires. So my movement background is quite diverse. I've also done some martial arts, different to you. I've done taekwondo, which is mostly leg work and not so much arm work. And so I love doing your classes because with a karate focus, it's the other way. It's more arm movement, more upper limb work. So that's essentially where most of my background comes. Of course, I'm also Pilates trained, which is already a movement therapy, which I recommend to most people if they've had no movement training to get into a Pilates class. So that's a bit about my background. How about you?
Quite similar to you. I actually didn't start that early. It was later, when I was, I think, 12 around, and then I finally decided to enter the martial arts dojo that was close to my home, and I really needed that kick of some friends who went there, and from that moment on I was just doing martial arts. I tried a couple of different things before. My parents still mocked me for trying to go to the football club. But
Nice.
I remember it was
Thanks,
not
Mum and
the
Dad.
most pleasant experience for me, because just the group dynamics and the teacher was not for me. And the moment I entered the martial arts dojo, I knew that's the thing for me, because I always, before that, I watched the martial arts movies where, like, people from wherever, mostly from America, go to China and they knock on the door of the monastery, and then they enter this realm of mysticism and training with masters who pass on much more than just movement. And that's what I was searching for. And that's also the reason why I had to expand the realm of my training. I entered an usual Shotokan karate school, which is a pretty good one in my hometown. Beautiful teachers, beautiful social environment. But I always wanted more. I was super curious, so I started to go to different workshops. At first, just different martial arts types, mostly just different karate styles to have a better overview. And later on, this developed into a much broader interest in movement. So first, other martial arts related things like Qigong, and then later on just every type of movement. And probably like your background, it the more you look into it, the closer you move to movement therapy, because you realize the potential behind movement is not just, from my background, having fun doing martial arts movements or being able to hit other people. That's just such a small part of it. Or
intention, isn't
or
it?
dancing, or having to entertain a crowd. But when the more you look into it, the more you see there's so much more potential behind movement in itself.
Yeah.
And it's overlapping everything, like dance and martial arts. It's not that far.
For sure. Actually, it's interesting, you touched on two topics there that I know is of mutual interest to us. That one first is that it's important for the learner, when you're looking at a new movement class, to appreciate that your intuition will actually tell you whether it's good for you or not. You know, nobody can tell you to go to a class, and for you, if it doesn't resonate with you, then you're not really going to learn anything from the class anyway. So it's better that if you don't really feel like you want to go, to at least kind of ask yourself, am I doing this just because someone's telling me to go, or am I doing it because I feel pulled to try it out from my curiosity? Because that makes the difference in the class. I'm more likely to get something out of the class. Even if the teacher is not that great, I'm still going to get more out of the class if I have an interest in it, and if my intuition is telling me that this is something for me to try. Trying is really important. The second thing you mentioned, and we've had this discussion before about how you can go to the same class. So I might go to two different karate classes, and if I'm training from someone who really feels the spiritual connection with the movement as an energetic being, because we're all energetic beings ultimately, and the science shows this, when I'm emotionally and energetically convinced that that's where I need to be, I learn better. My neurons fire and wire more strongly. So if I'm training from someone where you can clearly see their passion and their desire to share with you the spirit behind the movement, then you're going to get more out of the training, and you're going to connect better as a human being to the experience. So there's this real amazing change that happens to your brain when you train in that environment, as opposed to just going to someone who's just had training and doesn't fully understand the depth of the movement that they're teaching. It's a completely different experience. So I love that you touched on those two things, because I know that for both of us, we've had those conversations, and the science supports that neural rewiring. You know, if I'm going to spend my money and my time in a class, then I want it to be of most benefit to me. So those two things, I need to want to be there, I need to feel the pull and desire to be there, and I need to be able to connect to someone who's clearly passionate about what it is that they have to teach. And, you know, you can go into classes where they're technically proficient, but they just don't have any soul behind it. And so I'm going to learn differently, I'm going to connect differently with the experience. And on that note, I know we've talked about this as well, and the thing I love about martial arts as well as tango, the form that I've been teaching, because when we first met, we also talked about contact improvisation.
Mm-hmm.
In contact improvisation, obviously, it's about a shared point of gravity, and we move where that shared point of gravity shifts, and that creates the dance. And we both love it, and I know we both want to spend more time experimenting with contact improvisation, but I feel martial arts and tango both have this shared thing. There's always some mirroring that happens, and as human creatures, moving in an environment where we have a partner to work with is significantly beneficial for our therapeutic outcomes of movement. And so from your perspective as a teacher, like how much proportionately would you spend doing partner work as opposed to like for you, what's the important balance between individual training and partner work?
I think that's especially an interesting question for martial arts, because there you're kind of supposed to do partner work. But, mostly what I always say is most martial arts is very sportified today. It's not like it used to be. And that's what sparked my interest in researching furthermore. And this sportification usually goes in two different ways. It's you just practice the forms, and in the end it will end in entertainment art, just like dancing, but very very superficial, very athletic, but kind of superficial without the meaning behind it. Or the other way is sportive fighting, which you see especially in karate or in taekwondo, and even if it's very realistic, I also count MMA into it, which became such an important thing in the mainstream culture as well. But it lacks the background and the conscious movement work. Well, some practitioners like Conor McGregor, you can see in their background working with Ido Portal, they incorporate this stuff again, ancestral movements and just conscious body work. But it's out there. So my first thing was that I realized in karate the partner work that leads to really realistic self-defense, or what it's supposed to be, like a fighting art, was missing. So that was the first thing I learned from different masters all around the world, and I had really, really good masters here in Germany and abroad to bring back that partner work.
Yeah.
But in the first place, that was centered around realistic fighting. So of course you have exchange, you have conscious exchange, but it's very hard. And then when you go deeper into it, you incorporate stuff like Tai Chi and Qigong, then you learn, I can reach much more, and I can save my energy in fighting, still have very hard and applicable fighting, but when I apply consciousness and really touch feeling and sensing what the other one is doing and what I'm doing, and then you're so close to the therapeutic approach of movement. So partner work is very important. I think for my personal training it's 50-50 probably.
Yeah. I find in my experience as a tango teacher, in terms of dancing tango, with regards to people who only spend their time dancing in the couple, and because tango is stereotypically dancing with a partner, so most students of tango, when they go into a class, there's an expectation that they only work with couples. But what we found, particularly is for beginners, is that beginners lack the proprioception to understand how their physical body moves in space and time. So what that means is that quite often they may not be aware of how strong they are when they're handling someone else physically. They may not be aware of how much energy they're putting into something and how that's impacting the other person. And they certainly don't have the feedback mechanism to be able to feel the feedback once they've been a little bit inappropriate. They can't pick up that the other person may be uncomfortable. So the best way of resolving that is that individual training, is that learning about how my body works in space and time. You know, if I'm going to use this amount of force, then that's actually the amount of force that I need for this ends. But then if I want to use a little bit more, then it's going to give a different approach. And I need to build that relationship in my brain first in individual training. And when I then practice and train individually, it significantly improves my partner work, because then I have better awareness of when I move, how that impacts the other person. And so I understand this would happen also in martial arts, particularly with beginners, that they, and again, maybe you can correct me, but that they go in, they learn the movement, but learning the movement in partnership is not necessarily going to give them that other layer of awareness of how much strength they're using. So, you know, maybe when they're feeling like they're not very good at that, maybe taking some exercises home and training on their own is actually a good way of getting a little bit more confidence with partner work.
Yes, and like you said, realizing what you can do with your own body. And in martial arts, it's typical that some people, especially the male beginners, obviously they use way too much force, and then you have other people who are very shy, and they don't know what they're capable of with their body, even if they just weigh 35 kilogram or whatever. There's still so much force and potential in the body. And yeah, what I pick up from what you're saying, you're also a big fan of sequencing stuff. So what I always find is that, like you said, if you have the whole set of partner work, there's too much distraction for, not only for the beginner, I find that for myself when I'm training. So I love to sequence stuff and work individually or work on a very tiny bit of it.
Yeah.
So and that's something I wanted to ask, because I know you are a well-respected tango teacher in Australia, and when we talked, you emphasized fundamentals. So would you say that's the secret of you teaching other people, that you focus on the fundamentals, on the sequencing, or what is it that you say, this is what my teaching relies on?
Yes, well, it's a really interesting question, because I like to, in order to answer that, I look more at my own journey as a dancer, not necessarily as a teacher, although of course I have the evidence to show that the approach works as a teacher as well, because I tested this through all the years of classes that I've done with beginners and developing tango dancers. But when I was learning tango and I started to get an idea of what tango was in my head, when I tried it with my physical body, there's a period of time where I think I'm doing it better than I am. And so then when I try something more complicated, I would get frustrated, because I could do the simple stuff fine, but as soon as I would get it a little bit more complicated, it's like everything would fall over and I would get really frustrated. And I'd go to Tango Master, and you know, who I either was in Australia or in Buenos Aires, and I would be frustrated with what was my experience, and they would always bring me back to the fundamentals. And in tango, of course, the fundamentals really is walking. And a lot of us professional tango teachers, we kind of joke about private lesson students that nearly 90% of private lesson students that come to us, we just make them walk. You know, every single time, no matter how experienced they think they are, we always bring them back to the walk. And that's because the mechanics of the walk in that contains 100% all of the answers that they're seeking in all the complicated movements. But sometimes it's not until they actually try the more complicated movements that they realise that their fundamentals aren't actually as good as they think they are. And so it can be a very frustrating experience, because you go to a teacher and the teacher is like, I know you've had 5 years of tango training, but you have to come and learn to walk again. And the person's like, but no, I've spent 5 years trying to learn to walk. I think I know how to walk by now. And I'm like, no, but if you're trying a gancho, you're trying a volcata. The volcata essentially is an altered walk, and a volcata is considered an advanced move. But in that, a volcata, when it's very simplified, is actually really simple. A beginner can get a volcata if the beginner respects the fundamental movement. And so quite often when we start to get an idea of how good we think we are, and a teacher brings us back to the fundamentals, we get really upset with ourselves and with the teacher, and we think, oh, you're insulting me. It's like, actually, we're not insulting you. We're respecting the fact that you're a human with a body, and your body needs to build the relationship with your mind in order for you to be able to handle it. It's kind of like trying to drive a Ferrari when you've just got your learner's permit. You know, people had this expectation, as soon as I got my license, I can jump into a Ferrari and I can just drive it. But I can tell you now, you just get your learner's permit and you drive a Ferrari, you're probably going to scratch the car, because it's sensitive. It needs a bit of sensitivity in handling. So you need to go back to the basics, and you need to go back to reminding yourself how to drive a car safely, so that you can then, with a little bit more extra torque or a little bit more extra sensitivity on the handling, you know how to be able to in a fine, detailed way, actually manipulate the car. So the fundamentals are paramount to advanced level dancing, and I would expect the same would be in martial arts.
Yeah, it's super interesting always for me to find the similarities and how similar it is in the end, because basic learning principles, like we often talk about, the way of learning and the way of training is just fundamentally the same. And for me, it became more important, it's becoming more important every year I'm doing this work, that people start with basically understanding their body and their mind, and from there on you can work with whatever you want, the most difficult martial arts moves or the most easiest martial arts moves. There's no difference in the end, because also from the fighting outcome, it doesn't really matter if you win with the most easiest straightforward technique or with something fancy, but you need to understand the basic principles of your mind and your body. And then we are also straight in the realm of movement therapy and having something sustainable, because that's something you probably know that from the dance scene, that especially in combative or tournament martial arts, people get injured all the time. They are out with 34, 35, 40, whatever, because of their knee problems, their hip problems, and I saw that early on, and I always thought that's not my old imagination of the wise master sitting on the mountain and being able to fight better than the young guys. There's something missing, definitely. And I think that's it begins with the fundamentals of understanding your body, because in most martial arts there is too much yang involved in it, too much force, and people push into the movement because they have this thing in their mind. They see their teacher, and probably they hear the teacher screaming harder, faster, whatever, and that's how they do it. It's the perception that you have to be fast, hard, deeper stances and whatever. And it's just ruining ruining your long-term training, and it's also ruining what I saw on a longer perspective, ruining the style, because it pushes it further and further into a specific direction where it never had been in the past. Most styles, especially in karate, were much softer and much more relying on touch feeling and inner properties.
And we've talked also about this idea that because we naturally gravitate towards the therapeutic model now, that we're kind of hitting that kind of 30, 40 type of age bracket ourselves. Of course we don't look it, which is probably testament to the fact that we actually practice what we preach.
Hopefully.
Well, we've had to. I don't know about you, but my first actual injury, I was 16, and so injuries was a part of my process, because as a dancer, particularly when I started dancing, we didn't warm up and cool down. We didn't really understand so much how the body worked. We just went to a dance class and you just danced cold. And so it wasn't until, I was kind of in my teens that we started to get on this idea of warming up and cooling down. And by that time I was already experiencing dysfunctional movement in my body, because we would repetitively do unsafe movement, but not knowing it was unsafe. And so my body and my limbs have been stretched and distorted out of normal repatterning models. And so the injuries when I was 15 or 16, okay, didn't take that long to recover. But as I hit my 20s and subsequently 30s, the injuries were no longer so easy to recover from. And they would end up with, in fact, there was a period of time where I had knee surgery and I didn't recover from knee surgery very well. And so it stopped me dancing for 5 years completely. And when you've been dancing for nearly your entire life and then suddenly it stops, there's then obviously psychological shifts in your reality because your connection with your body changes. And we have a body, we all have a body, whether you're a dancer or not, so we all have some kind of feeling of knowledge of our body that makes us feel safe. And so when you have an incident that basically says to you, your body is no longer safe, it's going to have that impact on you. So having an understanding that we do need to have an awareness of our bodies, what our limitations are. I would also appreciate that the body likes multidisciplinarian approach to movement. It doesn't just like to do just karate. It doesn't just like to do just tango. You know, tango is really good with Pilates, for example, because tango can be very free-flowing, but we require quite a good core strength and an understanding of how to disperse the energy of movement across the spine. And so when we do that, then we protect our back and we protect our limbs and we protect generally our core axis. And so it's easier then if I'm dancing with someone who's not necessarily able to handle their Ferrari, their body, then I'm less likely to experience injury. So that's, I guess, where, I don't know about you if you've had significant injuries, but for me, the multidisciplinary approach has been vital to my well-being physically and psychologically because of that connection. How about you? What's been your experience with?
Luckily, I could always avoid to have major injuries in my my training career. I think I had a very good warm-up exercise regime I learned in the club where I started. They had a very high standard in this part of things. Still, the movement itself that is practiced in karate and in the forms then is not particularly healthy. It became just more sportive, longer, harder over the last decades. But I was kind of warned. So early on, I avoided the going into these extremes of the movements. I was always very flexible, which protected me in a way. And later on, when I started with Qigong and Tai Chi and all these inner arts, and that's my journey now, to implement that into the harder aspects of martial arts, and it will inevitably change it. That's what happens to my martial arts since probably 10 years now, and it can't stay that way. It will change, it will adapt, and that's how I think it's supposed to be, because it's my personal style. Of course, then it's not compatible to the usual Shotokan karate, for example, or other styles. I just have my very own style, and that's how I teach my students now to find their own style. And that's like you said, it's the body doesn't like to just do one set of movement, and especially because these sets of movement are invented by someone completely different and then changed over decades. So it's not supposed to be our own movement art. We have to adapt to it. We have to find our way, and then of course do also complementary other stuff, because our body is capable of doing so much things. If I would just want to hit people with it, it would be a very, very limited idea of the potential of my body.
Yeah. So in terms of choosing style, or maybe choosing someone to train with, if someone came up to you on the street and asked your opinion as to how one might approach that, what advice would you give?
You mean choosing a style of martial arts, for example?
Yes, or even choosing a particular practitioner of a particular style. Understanding, of course, different practitioners have their own unique way of moving. Yeah,
that's true. I mean, in martial arts, the variety is so massive, and it really depends on what the person wants. So you have these guys and girls, of course, who really only want this military type of self-defense. They want to survive on the street for whatever reason. Usually they are not really threatened, but it's just our minds love this sense of security. And obviously there are some people who need that for their environment, but then you could go to these styles like Krav Maga and Wing Chun, which is just very straightforward learning in the first time. And then you have people who just want this sportive entertainment kind of thing. They want a nice environment to practice. They want a little bit of traditional stuff they saw in the movies, but not too much. And then probably Shotokan karate or other karate styles or whatever is a nice way to do it. And then the people that usually approach me now, they are looking for something more. They're looking for the complete holistic package. And I always say that's not so easy to find. Of course, there are a lot of teachers out there, and it's a growing movement. And it's not easier in Asia. That's what often people are very surprised when I say that. It's absolutely not easier to find a very holistic old school in China or Japan. It's just as hard as in Europe because there are many Westerners who came to Asia, and they had the mindset of the outsider, and they were super curious. They were ignoring the political, the cultural barriers, and so I know a lot of Westerners who are much deeper into that stuff than the Asian counterparts.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for that holistic thing, you need to try out a lot of schools, a lot of teachers. And as you said, the more you know about movement, the more you know about yourself and movement, the easier it is to recognize a good teacher. It's not just from the talking, it's the way they move. For me, I can always see this internal, how I call it, internal style of movement, or if it's just external, if it's just copying movements from wherever the movement came from a book, from their teacher, from the internet, whatever. You see the difference.
Yes. And I guess that's why, at the moment there's I know we've been talking about how really good teachers sometimes have difficulty having a full class of students because everybody has this expectation that they can learn from the internet a lot of this movement work. How do you feel essentially about this progress towards more internet-based learning?
That's a very good question because, many people in our business are going in that direction. I think it's a good way. I had just 2 years back, I thought this is not a very deep way of learning. And then I just tried one internet training thing going over 10 weeks, and I thought, well, this is a very good thing, at least for me, because I know how to put the effort into it and I know how to observe myself doing the training. But just having this daily schedule was much more rewarding and giving me much more progress than I thought it would. So I think it's a very good thing. It's a complementary thing for me. I wouldn't say I can learn everything from the internet now, especially not the how they call it in Asia, the communication heart to heart.
Which is really cute.
Yeah.
And really, really vital actually in terms of that idea that, as humans, we actually need human contact. So we don't quite get that in the same fashion by the internet, do we?
That's true. And you can't feel the touch of your teacher. You can't feel how they are moving, and they are just where they get their internal power from. It's you can see that in videos, but I think you need the understanding in yourself first to really appreciate it.
Yes, for sure.
So tell us a little bit about your journey to the more therapeutic movement aspects and this ancestral movement, which we already talked about a little bit.
For sure. Well, the ancestral movement that I talk about is actually third-hand knowledge. I will confess that, because I have so much respect for the man who introduced me to ancestral movement, a man called Simon Thacker, and he's Australian-based, and he's quite incredible. I do recommend any practitioner specifically. I mean, any person who's just training should look him up as well, but he's really, really good for teachers to understand a lot more about the neuroscience behind ancestral movement and why ancestral movement is so effective as a therapeutic approach. But the reason why I found Simon is because I experienced a significant and life-altering injury about 10 years ago, where I ended up not being able to use my hands. And so it was considered a workplace injury, meaning that I had a high-stress job in an office environment, which was 95% computer-based. And so I spent 50 to 60 hours a week in front of a computer with a really high-stress workload. And I was basically giving my brain to the internet and not to my body. And so what happened over a period of time is my brain started to dedicate more resources to me being on the computer and out of my body than actually being connected to the neurological framework that's housed within our body. So I started to slowly have issues with my hands, and things would just randomly fall from my hands. And I was very puzzled by this at the time, because I wasn't experiencing a lot of pain. But eventually I got to the point where I completely lost the capacity for my brain to tell my hands how to move. And so I learned how to open doors with my feet, for example, and do a whole lot of range of things with my elbows and a variety of other things, body parts, which is in itself a bit humorous now in hindsight. But I started to do some investigations in the medical world, and the information I was getting from the medical world was that it was something I would just have to learn to live with. And that was unacceptable to me. I was in my early 30s at the time, and I just couldn't digest it. The idea of me being the dancer as not having connection to a part of my body was a form of death. You know, it was a death of my soul in a way. And so I had to do something about it. My stubborn aspect of my personality went, no, there has to be something else here. And so I started to apply a lot of the understanding I had of movement to look out different movement types to see how I could start to undo the negative effects of that office-based job. And the more I started to do my research, the more I realised I'm not the only person impacted by this type of scenario, although admittedly most people don't suffer that extreme a response to their physical body. And it's possible that the reason why mine went so extreme was because I had this significant neural connection to my body before that. So in contrast, it was quite significant a shift. So to answer your question, it was the quest for me to know why and to know what I could do about it that led me on to the ancestral movement, because there are a few things that some of the practitioners would say. They would randomly say things like, do you know when you dance, there's a protein in your body that just starts to heal everything? And they would just randomly say these things, but they would never give me any practical exercises. And I'd be like, well, how can I do that? You know, so I first, interestingly enough, the first movement class I went to was a Tai Chi class. Tai Chi, why? Because it's very fluid movement. So it's very water and flow based, but also there's a massive spiritual part that you can bring into it, and it's full body movement. So you might be moving your arms, but the energy doesn't come from your arms. The energy comes from your feet and is carried through the body, through the arms. And so that was the first movement reconnect that I experienced. And for the record, during that period of time, I actually danced tango without arms, which is kind of hilarious, actually. I remember doing this performance with my dance partner at the time, where we actually dressed me up as a doll and him as a magician, and I danced the whole thing without arms, and he had a wander hop so that people didn't know that it wasn't a part of the show.
That's awesome. It's a brilliant way to deal with it and learn something on the way.
But at the time, you know, we were still running classes, so it was still important for us to keep maintaining that aspect of stuff. So I had to also I really had to step out of the physical reality of what I was doing in the office and take it outside into nature. I had to take myself into nature. And so movement out in the physical world, it just has this complete, like the whole brain changes its reality, and it can rewire the things that you've lost. So so I started learning a little bit about brain science, about neuroplasticity, that is that capacity for our brain to change. Because what I understood is that when you have that type of an injury, the injury is not really in the body, the injury is actually in your brain. Because there's this inherent link between the body and the brain. So in therapeutic movement practices, you need to tackle the perception. You can't just tackle the physiological movement. You can't just tackle the mechanical movement, which is what a lot of physiotherapy, for example, does. It just says, here's a TheraBand, do this exercise over and over. But then when you're in your normal life, you can't actually call those muscles to work in that situation. So the cool thing about ancestral movement is that it is free-flowing movement that allows our brain to reconnect to the part of us that is inherently connected to our body. And when we mimic animals, we invoke certain cells in our body that allows us to remember who we actually are in a physical form. And so the science behind it is quite incredible. And to be honest, I'm not fully 100% across the science behind it, but I have seen it work and I've experienced it working. Most people have no idea how significant the injury was for me, because you can't see its impact on my daily life unless you know how to look. Am I 100% healed from it? Not yet. My brain is still changing. The beautiful thing that I know about my experience is that in a fashion, because I'm still working this way, it is preventing me from aging as rapidly as I was before. And I know that sounds a bit extreme, but it's 100% true. People have no idea how old I am. And they're always like, what's your secret? And I'm like, well, come into a dance class and I'll show you. Do they take the trouble to go there? No, because they don't believe that a movement class can actually undo the aging process, but it absolutely can if it's the right movement, because we are made to move. And most of the reason why we age so poorly is because most of us do not move enough. We don't move enough.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good point, especially because this rejuvenation process or idea is such a big thing in Taoist Chinese practices. So I'm pretty close to that from the Qigong and Tai Chi background, my training in the Wudang Mountains. And that's exactly when you hear about these immortality things and the 8 immortals in Chinese like folk tales almost, then of course you think that's just magical bullshit, to be honest. But that's what I think is conscious movement. It's not just movement. I don't think that movement just in itself is a good way. You can ruin your body with a lot of movement quite fast, but it's movement that is entwined and so close to your emotions, to your brain function, to your whole capacity. And in the end, we're both on the same line, that this is all the same. Our movement is kind of our emotions. Our you can't draw a line and say this is my emotional state and this is my body. And that's what is, it's not taught in the mainstream yet, and that's what makes it very, very hard for people to grasp it and then put the effort into it. And just by not acknowledging this, it's so hard to see the link and then train in that way. And when we train consciously, we always work on our emotional state. We work on our rewire. It's a difficult word for German English speaker.
Rewire?
Rewire. Just the connection between our brain and our body.
Yes.
Just to get this neurological traffic going into all parts of our body, where we are at this word brain mapping or brain and body mapping, and that most of us, we don't have a complete map of our body, or we all don't have a complete map of our body. We just think we have. And some people who are in a really bad state with their body and brain connection, they just know, well, this is my leg, That's kind of the only information they have. And then there's this little program of walking or doing something with your leg. But that's just a very sad state of connection between body and mind, and not to speak of the emotional problems that come with it and the emotional blockages. So your journey must have just been a great experience, to call it like that, because you had to go into that realm of what is my emotional state, what is it doing to my movement, and how can I entwine that again.
Yes, well, it's interesting you say that, because I was talking to a friend the other day about how for me still now some movement patternings, I have a memory of all the trauma I experienced when I did that movement patterning, that now when I go to do it, I have to be in a particular mindset before I do it, because otherwise it invokes the same memory. So for example, when I couldn't really use my hands, doing something like preparing food was extremely distressing. If I was hungry to be able to feed myself, I would have to push through physical pain in order to do so. So I have this emotional feeling of distress attached to me preparing food, or at least I did, because I've been rewiring it over a period of a couple of years now. And so in order to rewire that so that the thought of actually preparing food doesn't distress me, I had to almost put on a dance party in my kitchen and lift my energy and get me into a heightened, excited state before I prepare food. And when I do that, then the energy of my enjoyment of movement and dancing and just being free with my body carried into then the preparation of food. So now when I think about preparing food, I actually get an excitation experience. I start to feel excited at the idea of being able to get to prepare food for the first time in my life, interestingly enough, because before that I was a bit of an active avoider when it came to doing the work of preparing food. And so it's really been an interesting journey to go from extreme torturous pain and suffering at the thought of preparing food to absolute joy at the thought of preparing food now, because I've rewired the emotional association with the activity. And so you're right, and again, the science proves this. We have the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that tells us about ourselves. This is the conscious part of the brain. We have the brain stem that essentially is where the neural mapping is, essentially, that tells our body where it is in space and time. And then we have this homunculus, the amygdala, that is like the emotional center of the brain. And so whenever I think about my body, my brain, the information when I move my body actually transfers through the emotional centers of the body. So I either declare in my mind that a movement feels good or it feels bad, or it feels angry or it feels sad. And so we have this emotional tethering in the body. And in fact, Joe Dispenza, if any of you know of Joe Dispenza, amazing guy. I totally need to do his training. I need to do his training because I'm so excited. Every time I think about him, I get excited. His book was really amazing. But he was saying about how my brain is my thoughts, but my emotions are my body. And so when I'm feeling something, we feel it in the body. We translate it in the brain. We think about it in our brain, but we feel it in our body. And so this information is stored in our body when I'm experiencing something. And if you look at post-traumatic stress disorder and the psychoanalysis work that you can do with them to try to get them to talk about their situation, if they can do it if they're doing with their body something completely different to what they would usually do. But if they're repeating a physical pattern as to what they would usually do, they can't talk about it. And so there is this significant connection with movement and our capacity to actually talk about emotional invoking situations. There is this automatic tethering with movement practice and the emotions that can be healing, but also can be detrimental to us, particularly if I'm going into a training with the attitude of, I have to be perfect at this movement. Because you'll experience this also in martial arts with a student who has an expectation of perfect movement. When they're training with you, they become very difficult to train, because if they don't get it right the first time, they get angry with themselves and they can make their body move it, but then they're associating this anger with the movement. And so then they end up just in this fight or flight distress situation every time they move, and they're not really in a relaxed, enjoyed flow state. And so it's all that yang energy and none of that yin energy, and we need the both to fully enjoy movement, to fully experience movement, and to be efficient as a systemic human being. And so that coupling, because I know we talk about this a lot, about how a lot of people, particularly because of the way we're trained in this competitive environment that the world is offering us, that we often train the yang and we go in for the powerful movers, the big muscle groups, you know, and we really ignore the small muscle groups and the subtle movement and the coiling of energy before the releasing of the energy. You know, we're all about the releasing of energy. We're not actually about building that spirit first. And so for you, what would you recommend to people? How do you work on that? Like, how do you work on bringing more yin energy into your yang experience?
Yeah, that's always a good question. I mean, my personal approach, or the approach I'm using, is working with the tool of Qigong. So even in my martial arts realm, the classes always start with Qigong. There's always this Qigong part, and then my other business is teaching Qigong teachers in our system, Secret Elements Qigong, which is really focusing on this fine connection between our emotions and our movement. And first thing, of course, people, you can't push them right into the Qigong movement. And it's not about feeling energy or energy balls right away. People often expect that from Qigong, just feeling the magic. It's calming down your whole system, and just like this beautiful old Zen idea of a lake which has a lot of waves, you can't see through, you can't see the ground. So you need to calm this down first, and then what they call in the Wudang mountains is just getting finer and finer. And you can translate that to just finer connection between your body and your mind, or more consciousness in your movement. And that for me is the first round of everything. And just this is a foundation for everything else. I would do that if I would teach golfers, if I would teach tennis players. I would start with Qigong just as a tool. It could be something else, but Qigong is just a very advanced tool for this, to calm them down and let them experience their body very consciously, very fine. And from there they can generate a lot of energy, a lot of yang. Like you said in the camp where we were teaching, that when you strengthen your yin, you strengthen your yang, but people don't understand that usually. And it's such a beautiful thing to understand. I say that's how the universe works. But we always only think, because we were raised in that society, as you said, we always we look at the yang part of things, and we think we have to play around with it, boost it in a way, and we completely ignore the yin side of it, which is the foundation for all the yang endeavors or whatever.
And just to clarify, when you're saying that people don't understand, or there's this misunderstanding that when you focus on yin, you're actually taking away from yang. You're actually saying that a lot of people see this as more of a feminine trait, more of a subtle trait, and they feel like by focusing on the subtleties that they're actually completely giving away all of their energy to the subtle movement, and so that they don't have any strong. And there's this understanding that if they go and learn the yin, then they're going to lose the yang. And the opposite is true, if you have all of this yang, because we naturally come from a yang world, just because of the way our society is structured and the competitive nature and the education system that's always putting tests on us and always pushing us to be better at what it is that we do, rather than necessarily to enjoy more of what it is that we do. And obviously, as we've talked about before, this has flow-on effects to your health, because this is why our society seems to have so much stress and too much stress, hypertension and those types of issues. They come from this belief that I have to work more yang because I'm not good enough. And so instead, when we work on the yin, it's not about taking away the yang, because the yang is inherent in our system anyway. It's about reminding yourself that you need balance to be a whole functioning human being. And so I know with regards to a lot of the coaching aspects of what it is that we both do, a lot of people avoid the intuitive stuff. They avoid the feeling stuff, that real subtle appreciation of the shifts within that happen. And they do that to their detriment, because if you can't understand what's within, then the outside world is going to be unkind to you.
Or can treat you badly or use you for whatever.
Or you end up with injuries, or you end up with burnout, or you end up with chronic fatigue, or you end up with, I don't know, people don't like you and you don't know why. And maybe it's because it serves you to spend some time learning the skill of listening and being okay with listening without judgment, without needing an opinion about something. And I must admit that when I first met you, I appreciated because obviously I met you in a training course, and I was very lucky that particular weekend I was the only person in your training course. So I had you the whole weekend, and we got to talk, we got to share. It wasn't just you teaching me, you also gave me an opportunity to share my story. And so you showed me how valuable, how much value you had for me simply by listening. And so I had more respect for you because I felt valued because you were listening to me.
Yeah, that's maybe a beautiful example for yin, applying yin. And yeah, I think I always have to observe myself if I'm, especially in a conversation, you always have these different things coming up. There's always this young part telling you, you should say this and that, and what is the other one expecting from you to say now, or how to respond, and just letting go, and sometimes just listening. It's not that easy, but something you need to be aware of first, and then it's something I like to practice.
So how would you apply listening and movement? Like because we're talking a little bit more about, the act of having a conversation, but how would you apply this principle in a movement situation?
I think listening is a beautiful word for movement practice. Listening with your body, and one of the most obvious techniques I use is partner exercises in Qigong or Tai Chi, and we use the same ones in our external fighting classes, where you're really supposed to be absolutely passive and listen to the movement the other one is giving to you. So we just establish a very slight, very fine touch. And then the passive partner has closed eyes and is supposed to just follow the movement without applying his or her own movement idea. And it's just a nice example for a listening exercise. And it is so hard to do because in our environment we are trained to always apply kind of a hard idea of what we're going to do next, of where we're going to walk, where we put our hands. It's so hard for us to be completely submissive, but not in a bad way. It's just listening, and out of that passiveness, of course, you could be active in an instant, even with much more force and much more speed. That's the funny secret behind it, than if you would constantly apply your ideas. It's this idea of the Zen master just sitting and observing, and whenever it is needed, he can just right away use his force, but most of the time there is no need.
Yes. So if I were to, because I've done, obviously in the Italian retreat, we did quite a lot of partner work with some of the karate sequences that you gave us. And so if I were to use an analogy of what it is that you just explained to me, if a partner was coming and punching at me, then if I'm applying my listening skills in movement, then as they're punching me, I'm observing and experiencing the movement that they're creating towards me. And as I receive that information, I can see their trajectory going in a particular direction, and I can use that information for me to then apply a point of attack or a point of defense. Is that?
Yeah. I would say it begins even earlier. The most important thing in this type of fighting situation is I'm not an advocate of just doing the Aikido or Tai Chi style of beautifully deflecting all the punches and then putting the other one in a nice and gentle arm lock and then walking away. This is usually not realistic. Fighting
nice.
It sounds beautiful, and I would love to apply that, but the actual thing is fighting is often brutal. It ends on the ground. It's not nice, and but what happens inside of the fighter, that's a totally different story, and that's what's defining the outcome in the end. And if you're in this threatening situation, there's just so much going on in your brain, and then there's so much neurotraffic from your brain into your body. And if that is completely messed up with strong young information, then you will probably be too slow to react. You will react in a way that's not supporting your survival. And you see that even in PAT or like the boxing sack training, when people really want to hit, then it's not very efficient hitting force. When they are hitting what I often call like lazy punching, or some call it heavy hands, then this is a very strong force, because it comes from the ground, from your center, from the dantian, and then in an efficient way through your body into the target.
Yeah.
But with every strong information your brain like frantically sends to body parts, you will block this flow of energy. And this is not a very esoteric point of view. This is just a physical point of how the force travels through your body.
Yeah.
And it's determined in your brain in the end.
Yes, which goes back, I guess, to that body map training that we were talking about before, that importance of self-training and being aware of where you are in space and time, and building that relationship between your physical body, your limbs, and your brain, and doing that in individual work and body map training. Yeah. So how would you apply this, or how would you... if someone comes to you and you directly know where kind of the problem lies, how would you give them the idea of that very close interconnection between emotions and their body movement? Well, the good thing about tango as a vehicle for movement is that most people who come into tango associate tango with passion. And so it is relatively easy to explain to people that your emotions are going to matter in your movement. But that said, in terms of any dance training, usually when people are moving, I ask them how they feel about the movement as they're doing the movement, so that they can start to have a dialogue with me about how the movement feels for them. Now, how the movement feels for them, they might talk about it mechanically and say, oh, I feel like my foot should go there, but it's going there, or I feel like my foot is not quite landing properly. And they start to talk about using the word feeling. And so I think this already indicates to us that there's some emotional attachment to movement, because I feel movement. I don't think movement, I feel it. And so from there, then we would start to then talk about this idea of harmonious movement. And so harmonious movement is where I'm moving and I feel free and easy, and there's flow inherent in my movement. And so it's easy then for people, particularly if they're thinking people, to say, okay, so if you were happy, how would you move? And so if people would then think about being happy, their movement changes, and I can flag that with them and say, okay, so this is just showing you that impact essentially of the emotional aspect of you and how that expresses yourself in movement. Of course, also there's always that analogy, and I like to use this one, is that if you've ever seen babies dance, if you put movement music on, usually you can see that their mood changes, and then they start to move, and they usually move according to how the music is telling them. Yeah, so if it's fast, they move fast, and if it's slow, they move slow, and they do this instinctively. And so I always like to remind people that at the end of the day, babies can dance and we can. The only thing that's blocking us essentially is our perception of self. So it always comes down to how you feel and how you think about yourself. And we use the language of emotions to do that.
Yeah, so basically bringing back joy into movement, right, is one of the fundamental things.
And, you know, there's a science, again, to support this idea that when we're happy, our cells expand, you know, they excite differently. And when we're angry, everything just starts to shut down and constrict. And you can see this in movement patternings. You know, the stereotypical idea of if you see someone walking down the street and they're angry, most people can usually tell, because they're going to walk differently. If they haven't got a care in the world and the sun's shining and they're really happy, they'll walk differently. And so it's inherently in our nature to do this. Children learn body language before they learn verbal language. They can see what's going on with you before they can have the words to speak it. And so ultimately, it is more natural to us, and it is our first language. Movement is actually our first language before our verbal language. The language of words is a thinking program. It's not actually the only language we have in our intelligence, in our system.
Yeah, and a very constricted way of communicating, as we often find out. It's a very efficient one. It can be a very efficient one, but it's still using these boxes. And what I found out, it's also it can be very limiting in movement arts. I mean, in karate, for example, we have these words, these Japanese words for the techniques, and but the movement is not that word, and it is much more than the meaning of the word. The meaning of the word is sometimes just like a straight kick, straight punch, something like that. But there is so much more in that movement, and if you only think in these boxes, your movement will be in that box. You're just trying to imitate that technique or the idea behind it, but just this straight punch, there is, just from the application, it can be 1,000 different applications, and then how you do it for yourself, your own interpretation of that movement, there are a million different varieties. So the word can be very limiting. It's just a help tool, of course, but in the end it's just a signpost,
an idea.
Yeah, it's an idea. Just a way to communicate, so people can communicate about it in the class, but that's all. It's not the technique itself, it's not the movement itself. We have to bring out that movement somehow from our core.
Yes. Well, that's also why I find, you know, you were asking before about how to articulate to people about emotions and movement and why they work so well together. You know, there's so much research now, and, you know, all of us dance teachers have kind of been laughing because we've known this for some time, that if you look at the research, for example, around people who are suffering depression, they actually get significantly better shifts in their mood through dance classes than they do through psychotherapy. And through traditional methods of talk therapy, you know. So we all need to talk and express ourselves, but if we actually start to move around a subject matter, we shift significantly more. So it makes more sense that if we want an improved outcome, that we can't just talk about it, we can't just think about it, we can't just look at the psychology behind it. We actually need to look at the movement patterning around it. We actually need to look at the emotional association with it, and it's very easy to bring this out and to create a shift in the energetic balance within us through movement. And so sometimes, you know, like I said, us dance teachers have known this for ages. I know as a child, when I was going through a difficult time, I would put on music and dance, and it would automatically give me answers I didn't have access to before, because it shifted that energy out of my brain where I think I know everything into that energetic heart space where I feel like I have other options. I feel like I can do something with this energy.
I think that's such an important point that is often missed in usual therapy. But at least I always felt that I need this movement part, because I'm born into this body, and that's my, like you said, it's the first tool of expressing myself. And that's like in dance teachers always knew that, and it's the same for Qigong. It was always in well, not always, but sometimes when you had a really good Chinese doctor, you would get acupuncture. You would probably talk about your stuff, your illness, and you get herbal treatment. But you also got a qigong exercise, and it's this whole package of things that makes the difference.
Yes. And it's interesting to me that we're going back to those more Eastern practices now. You know, Western medicine is starting to open a little bit more to this holistic approach, and more programs are starting to offer more movement-based practices. Again, you know, it's interesting to me that we took so long as a society to get there, because the knowledge has been with us since forever. The ancient practices supported breath practice, for example, and we know if you look at Wim Hof's method, you know, he's a massive advocate of breath training, and we know that he's shown scientifically that we can alter the immune response with neurotoxins. You know, you can inject a whole group of people with neurotoxins if they've done a little bit of his breath training and the cold exposure. It lifts their immune system so much that their immune response is significantly altered in a way that protects them from poisons and toxins. So, yes, I know that you've done some of Wim Hof's training. So, yeah,
it's just a good example. How also his success tells us that people are searching for that, and they want this connection back, and more and more people, like you said in the beginning, not accepting anymore that probably very often medicine doesn't give us any solution for the specific problem we have. And in my case, I never accepted, for example, that like in the mainstream culture, people just assume that almost everyone gets cancer at one point in their life. And I was quite afraid of cancer because my granddad died of it, and he was very important to me. So I was always very afraid, but I probably had the same stubbornness like you and the curiosity. So my path led me to not accepting that I probably can't help it, and that probably medicine can't help me when I get cancer. So all my path was basically finding my own way of preventing illness, and just not accepting that I'm supposed to be not in charge of my destiny, which I totally am. That's the main point of
we have
all
free
the
will.
work. Yeah.
We're advocates of free will.
Yeah, and that reflects on our body, that reflects on our emotional state and everything we do.
For sure. So if you were to have someone to come to you and ask you about how to start with breath work, understanding that breath work is the number one easiest method for us to bring some form of movement into our daily lives, how would you start, or where would you start? What would you recommend?
Well, from my more traditional background, I had some training in Zen meditation. I have a beautiful friend and Zen master in Japan. So obviously when I meditate, I have a fair amount of emphasis on the breath work, which I start very easily. If I would explain it to someone, it's just consciously breathing. I think it's such a big step forward, such a leap forward, and the same accounts for Qigong. It's just it's linked to movement. So that would be probably my next step then. Very conscious breath work without much of a rule behind it. Just experiment with it, play around with it, keep it very, very soft and enjoyable. And then the next step for people who want something specific or who train with me in martial arts or whatever, I would go to a more young type of breath work, like the Wim Hof method, which is just a beautiful way to experience our body from within, but also with the outcome of performance in a way. So Wim Hof just expanded my idea of the young part of the breath work. So, but I would again start on the inside of it, just very conscious, slow breath, just experiencing it. And like you said before, of course there are breath methods in yoga styles which have a lot of technical aspects behind it, and I like to do that for myself, but for a beginner I would like to get away that barrier of rules and just say play around with it and enjoy breathing, because it's such a fundamental thing. We should absolutely enjoy it.
Yes, for sure. And so for you, I assume you'd be like me with meditation in terms of getting someone started. Would you recommend that the first meditation that they try be a breath meditation?
Sometimes I start with breath meditation, like the classical Zen meditation. You count 10 breaths in or out, whatever, and then you start all over again from 1 to 10. It's a very easy way to start, but on the other hand, I like other introductory ways to meditation, like scanning parts of your body, or focusing on the air going in and out through your nostrils. It's all beautiful methods. It just should be easy, one focus point maybe in the beginning.
So what is the benefit of meditation? Like, why would you be recommending meditation to anybody?
Yeah, sometimes I think meditation is, for me, like the very fundamental state of existence for humans. It's a funny and good question, because sometimes people ask that, and they don't ask it from your perspective. They ask it from the perspective of an outsider, thinking like, why the heck is he wasting his time with meditation? And well, there's something in me resisting this question and saying, why wouldn't you meditate? It's such a fundamental state of your being.
Yes.
And I always remember this little story when I was driving from Marrakesh over the Atlas Mountains to the Sahara Desert, and there were these I think goat shepherds, or goat herds, however you want to call them.
Yes.
And
goat herders, I think, is the English
goat
term.
herders sounds good.
Yes.
And they were just sitting there on a rock in this very, very rough landscape and just observing their goats doing the same thing all day. And it just felt so meditative, and I just realized that this is so far from our nowadays way of living, but it used to be the normal way of living for most people just a couple of centuries ago. Just having so much more free time, like many alternative thinkers say, we're working way too much. That's not our natural state of existing. And so there would be so much more space for being in this meditative state. So when I do my short morning meditation, or I say you should do this short morning or evening meditation, it's just to catch up this massive amount of free time and meditative time we are lacking nowadays. It's just, for me, it's a very natural state of existence as a human being. And as animals as well, if you observe most animals, they're just staying there, and they are in this trance-like meditative position.
Yes, like cats. They seem to be natural meditators.
Yeah,
they stare into space, like Fine here.
She is just sleeping the whole time.
Well, it's actually funny you say that, because I was having a conversation with someone about how sometimes we, because we do constantly try to fill our lives with so many things, our brains never turn off, that maybe adopting a lifestyle of a cat where we sleep more and maybe a little bit more productive for us, because then if we had more sleep, we would then, when we are awake, be a lot more productive in the short period of time we're actually working. So we would get more done in a shorter period of time and be more efficient and have more time to relax and rest and digest. And I know the research that I did when I was working to heal my body, I came across a lot of breath work, and most of the information was around this idea of using the breath to switch from that fight or flight response, that heightened, overstimulated nervous system situation that we're all in because we're hyper-stimulated by everything that's going around. You know, our sensory cortexes are filled with all of this sound and vibration, and you know, we're all losing our eyesight because we're staring at computers and we're getting all of these pixelated information that doesn't necessarily, you know, stimulate us in a way that awakens our sight anymore. You know, if you watch movies, they don't allow your imagination to be stimulated anymore. They show you everything. And so in a fashion, we're actually quite lazy at our experience because we're overstimulated. We're expecting everything to be there for us. And so that hyper-stimulated state needs more rest so that our bodies can digest and repair, and so that we can give our body an opportunity to rewire, or, you know, like that idea that if I don't have enough time for rest, then this is going to impact my reproductive system, my hormonal balance. And so a lot of allergies and a lot of food sensitivities may just be easily explained by not enough breath work and not enough rest state. And our bodies, because we do know that our brains dedicate resources to the things that it does the most. If I'm not practicing rest, then my brain doesn't remember how to rest. It just remembers how to be on all the time. And so one of the first things I tell my clients if they come to me and they're suffering autonomic nervous system distress, or they're suffering some form of chronic fatigue symptoms, is breath work. 5 minutes a day in the morning, vital to everything that you do. You do that, significantly improves your energetic availability. And so you can do more with your time, and your prefrontal cortex stays more open, so you have access to your thinking centers, your clarity of thought. This all comes just with one basic breath technique.
Yeah, I think it's a really important example. This, and we are back at this yin and yang aspect because we're totally overstimulated, but this is like a self-propelling problem because overstimulated brains want more stimulation to still feel that there is more to gain, and we are almost not capable of shutting down and going to the yin state, which would be the really necessary thing to do. So, like you said, breath work then can bring us down because we're using the body to calm down the mind in that sense. And that's how I also would use movement, like Qigong or whatever, because we can bypass a mind that is still very agitated or very active. It's very hard for people to tell them, lay down and meditate now. The difference is just
not gonna work. Not the right time.
So using breath work or using movement is a way to bypass that problem, and then it's almost like a trick, calming down the mind. So talking about this breath work and 5 minutes in the morning, what is your daily routine? What's your morning routine, and do you have routines over during the day and in the evening?
Yes, well, that's a really good question, actually, because what I found with my my injury, the root cause really was overwork. And it really was that I was constantly in this state of distress. And so what I started to do, eventually I realized that I needed to sleep more, and I needed to give myself permission to have fully restful sleep and not to spring out of bed in the morning and make myself out of balance. And I know that that sits in contrast with a lot of the current mood of a lot of practitioners, that they're like, you know, if you look at the Tim Ferriss's, and he wrote that kind of 4-hour work week or whatever, but it's like, so I can maximize all of my time so that I can do all this stuff. But, you know, there seems to be this emphasis on being efficient and making my time more efficient. And I'm like, actually, I don't know if efficiency in terms of working in that, because for me, that's a yang way of working. You know, I'm trying to be efficient in a yang way, whereas I actually feel like we can be more efficient in a yin way. So particularly being a woman, because my nervous system works a little bit differently to a man's. So my morning routine is very interesting in that I usually sleep without an alarm. So I wake up when I feel my body is ready to wake. And the first thing I do is I roll my feet over the side and I'll breath work, meditation. So just go into that. Now, if I know that I've got something on in the morning, I'll do at least 5 minutes of breath work. If that's all I get, fine. But on an ideal morning, I usually don't start work until, like, I don't do client contact until about 12 o'clock. In the morning, I'll do an hour meditation if I get to. If I'm lucky enough to do it in sunshine, full sunshine, I'll do that. So I allow my skin to absorb the DNA and the vitamin D and all of that beautiful chi energy from the sun. The meditation, I'll sit in it as long as I can maintain that energy. And then as soon as it starts to feel like I can't maintain that energy anymore, I thank myself for the effort and give myself a big boost of gratitude. And then I get into movement practice. And so then I'll do movement practice. Now, I intuitively move when I do my movement practice. And that's because the beautiful thing about having however many decades of dance training I have and movement training I have is that I know that my body is just seeking to find balance. So I set an intention with my movement practice that I want to refine and regain my balance so that the rest of my day is starting with balance. And so I'll then do into movement practice, and I won't eat until after I finish my movement practice, because I want to warm up my body and I want to get used to being awake and used to being in movement before I actually bring any work to my digestive tract. And so that's usually what I do. And then from there, I kind of look at dietary interventions, because I also believe that with regards to movement, we also need to look at food choices and how we eat. Because if I go and get up in the morning and just stuff my face with a whole lot of greasy food and a whole lot of meat and processed meats particularly, then what's going to happen is my digestion is going to slow me down, because all the energy is going to go into my digestion to try to digest all of this meat. And this is going to take energy away from my clear thinking centers. So I tackle it on a variety of different spaces, because I believe that we are being ignorant if we deny the fact that we are not just a thinking human being, but we're a moving human being, and we're also a human being that needs to consider our energetic expression. So that's usually what I do. And then I do a bit of a cleansing ritual, and then I'm focused. And then from 12 o'clock, I can work for 8 hours if I need to. And I can pretty much solidly work through with clients and whatever I need to do. And that's the way that I choose, because that's the way it works for my system. Now, I know a lot of other people, morning, they can get up and start working straight away, and they prefer to do that, and they prefer to do all of their training at the end of the day. And I'm an advocate that if that's the way that you work, then that's the way you should work. But minimum 5 minutes of breath work before you do that.
I love the intuitive way you approach this thing, that you say, I don't have this fixed thing, I'm just feeling into my body and let it move however it likes to. And also, I'm a big advocate of the gratefulness thing. This aspect of I think you already have a big part of your emotional training covered when you just implement a little bit of gratefulness practice into your daily schedule. And
sure.
Just meditating as long as you feel good, and then thanking yourself for doing it and bringing in that effort. That's a beautiful thing. I have to try that, because I usually still put my alarm to 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then I go for it. And then sometimes, of course, you have these days where you, after 10 minutes, it's not really working anymore. Well, yeah, that's a beautiful way.
Well, I believe there's kind of like a tipping point at which it stops becoming healthy and helpful. So if I get to a point where I'm really distressing myself in order to be there, I'm rewiring this negative association to the experience anyway. So I kind of have this tipping point where if I'm fussing too much and I can't settle in, and sometimes that happens to me, then I'll change what I'm doing. So if I'm doing just seated meditation, and I'm fussing and I can't get further than 10 minutes, then what I do is I stand up and I adopt a movement meditation. So instead of doing a seated meditation, I'll bring it into movement. And so that will redirect the energy from my mind into my physical body. Just by the nature of me having to physically move, my attention is already directing into physical movement. So I do more mindful movement and less breathwork meditation practice. So, and that's what I do if I can't settle when I get to that point where I'm fussing too much, because otherwise if I push into that distress mode, the work that I would do in meditation, making myself stay there, is probably going to push me into an intolerant zone, where I'm negatively wiring the association of meditation with discomfort. And so I do respect that. When I meditate, and I actually do this sometimes as a practice, I do an ease meditation where my focus is to find the ease in my body. I can do this in movement as well when I'm training my body, particularly intuitively. I look for the ease. I don't look for the problem. I don't go searching for the knee that's hurting. I actually go searching essentially for the part of my body that feels amazing today. And then I look for another part of my body that feels amazing today. And when I find a part that's not quite amazing, I try to channel the energy of the ease into the body part that's not really easy. And so this is completely different to the way I used to train and the way I was taught to train, which was essentially find the problem and fix the imbalance. So now I'm fixing the imbalances in a fashion, but I'm doing it by focusing on the balance, by focusing on the ease, and by focusing on the things that I want to bring in. And this is the beautiful thing about an effective gratitude practice, is that a gratitude practice, and I know I said I thank myself. I believe it's important for us to show gratitude for ourselves because we are loving, caring, compassionate human beings, but the more loving and compassionate that you are in this society sometimes translates in a fear of being selfish. So what we often do is we put everybody else's needs ahead of our own. And so I can easily thank all the people in my life that I can recognize are amazing human beings. But do I take the time to actually thank myself for being an amazing human being? Because I believe that you can only see amazing human beings if you yourself have an aspect of that in you. So I do like self-gratitude, but I also do a gratitude practice where I like to look at all the things, of course, that I'm grateful in my life for. And as you know, when you practice this, it's a muscle. And so eventually what I found, because I did a year of solid gratitude practice where every morning I would light a candle and a gratitude altar that I built, and I'd always list all the things that I was grateful for because I chose that as a conscious human being to focus my energy there. And what I found is that then when things went wrong in my life, I was able to be thankful for it. And I surprised myself. The first time I was like, actually, I'm really thankful for this experience because I know that once this problem is resolved, it's out of my life and I've learned a lesson from it. And so a gratitude practice in the beginning, it's kind of a bit, academic. You just do it and you're like, why am I doing it? I can be thankful. I'm thankful. See, I'm thankful. Like you kind of get a bit, crazily ambivalent about it. But when you actually bother to do the practice regularly, there's a shift that happens in your cellular structure. Your brain starts to appreciate and dedicate more resources towards this looking for things to be grateful for.
Yeah, it's a training process and a muscle, like you said.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think we could go on for forever with these topics that we obviously both quite enjoy. And
of course, it's always a pleasure to speak to you about these things.
Yeah,
always
same
enjoy
for
our
you.
Conversations.
So,
particularly when we come from completely different sides of the world, completely
different sides of the
cultural
world,
backgrounds.
different background in moving arts, but in the end, it's also similar if you dive into it. That's the beautiful thing about it.
Yes, and I know that because obviously you've been quite. Your whole life you spent time looking at different movement practices because you've had an innate curiosity about what else is out there. But I know also that the more we do that, the more we look at what's out there, the more we see how similar movement is generally in all practices. And so it comes back to those fundamentals that I was starting at the beginning of this talk. Everything fundamentally comes down to the mechanics of the human body and the brain and how we interact with it. So thank you so much for...
Thank you for this beautiful interview, and I'm sure we'll work a lot together in the future, and see you next time in Germany or Australia.
Beautiful. Either or, both.
Yes.
Let's find it in Bali.
Bali is nice, wonderful.
All right, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to dig deeper into our work, check out thebutterflytechnique.com for Dana's work and lifeatlasjourneys.com for my work and all the retreats we organize. And if you want to join us in the next Spirit of the Hero Camp, there we will cover a lot of the topics we just discussed. And check out lifeatlasjourneys.com and you will see the next dates for the Hero Camp.